number of seminars where we are going to be looking at children on the move. The reason that we've called this event Remember and Respond is out of respect to a Kurdish Iranian family who died on the 27th of October last year in the Channel as they attempted to enter the UK. Rasul Iran Najad, Shiva Mohammed Panahi, and their children, Anita, aged 9, Armin, 6, and Artin, 15 months old, all drowned. Ordinary people, loved and loving, lives lost as a result of national borders and state policies. And unusual because we know their names. We don't know the names of the vast majority of people who die and are otherwise harmed by immigration and asylum policy. And even if we did, there are too many for us to remember. So these deaths are standing for many, many others. And the deaths of children hit particularly hard. This is, I think, partly because of ideas of potential of so many years and possibilities lost of what might have been. But it's also because children are one of the few non-market ways that we globally connect. When children are treated unjustly, we can feel its harm and how it harms all of us and shames those of us who are in the rich world. So I'm going to suggest that at the end of this session, we have 1 minute silence to remember the deaths of people who have died in their efforts to cross borders, particularly children, and to reflect on what we've learned and how we can take it forward. So what can we do as migration researchers in the face of this injustice? We can't just file and forget. So how can we use the resources that we're privileged to have access to remember and respond in however small a way? We're very lucky to have here 3 people who do this work in very different ways and who are going to share their knowledge and thoughts with us. So first, we're going to hear from Anne Singleton. We're very lucky that Anne is our MMB Policy Strategic Lead. Anne is Senior Research Fellow in the School for Policy Studies and has an advisory role in several national and international research institutes, including the IOM Global Migration Data Analysis Centre in Berlin. She has particular expertise on international migration data, the production of knowledge on migration and the development of migration and asylum policy. And as regards the topic of our conversation today, she's the co-editor and author of IOM's Fatal Journeys report on missing migrant children. And she's worked closely with UNICEF and IOM to improve the quality of official data on migrant children. So Anne's going to give us the big picture on the global situation regarding migration and children. She'll be followed by Sam Occhiere. Sam is a socioanthropologist and senior lecturer in sociology at the School of Sociology, Politics and International Studies here at Bristol. He's primarily interested in the linkages between human and child rights, power and ethnicity, and freedom, globalization, and the legacies of the slave trade and colonization, mainly but not exclusively in African contexts. Over the past decade, he's explored these issues through extensive field research on child and youth labour and labour mobility in a wide variety of sectors, and looked at also West Africa, EU migration and sex work. Finally, we'll hear from Nadine Finch. Nadine Finch is an honorary senior policy fellow in the School for Policy Studies at the University of Bristol. And again, we're lucky to have her attached to MMB. She's also an associate at Child Circle, a centre of expertise and public interest action on child protection and European measures. She was previously a human rights barrister who specialised in children's rights, migration, child trafficking and international family law. She's undertaken research projects and published the results of this research for UNICEF, UNHCR, OHCHR, Harvard University Committee on Human Rights and the European Commission, amongst others. So these were on issues like child migration, child trafficking, criminal justice and human rights law. She was previously an immigration judge and remains an active member of the group of International Association of Refugee and Migration Judges. So Nadine is going to talk today about children at the UK border and channel crossings. So welcome to everyone, and welcome to the other participants. Each of our speakers will talk for 10 minutes, and I'm going to ask you to put questions in the Q&A for me to put them to the speakers, because that way we can record the full session and the kind of conversation between speakers and the answers. Otherwise it gets very complicated with consent. So again, a big welcome to everyone who's here, and I'm going to now pass over to Anne Singleton. Thank you, Anne.
Thank you very much. I'm going to speak about what is known at the official level and the evidence base used by authorities at national and international level to frame their understanding of what's happening with the movement of children and migration of children. And I'd like to emphasise that throughout this, the efforts that we've made to improve the quality of official data, the whole exercise has been, in a way, is hampered by the fact that the whole migration studies and the policy framework for this area involves a challenge where there is insufficient data, there is insufficient understanding of what is happening at international level, and all the efforts that are made to improve the official data can turn into an exercise in which the data become the story rather than the people and the children becoming the story and the focus of study. So it's a tension in doing this work to constantly try and remind migration researchers and colleagues and policymakers that the data are not in themselves the story. At the same time, you have to explain the problems with the data because they are used for all sorts of reasons in political positioning around resources and around priorities in research. So I hope that what I'm going to say will give you some idea about the strengths and weaknesses in the official data evidence base and the way in which I think this should not become the main part of the story, although it is an essential element in the way in which we understand what's happening. So there have been significant efforts made in recent years to improve the data, and we now have an international data alliance on children on the move, which includes UNHCR, IOM, and UNICEF and other bodies. And I've just left a meeting of the Africa Migration Data Network, which is having a launch today, in which children on data will be one of the priorities for improving data in Africa on migration. And all of these initiatives hopefully improve the evidence base, but when I say we, I mean the researchers, still do not have sufficient information to be able to inform policy in an informed way on the basis of the official data. So sometimes I have to challenge saying, we don't know what is happening. Actually, people, families of the children involved in migration, they know the names of their children, the family members. It's the officials that don't know the names and don't prioritise often enough the fact that we're dealing with discussions around children. So I'd argue that children must be treated as children first, regardless of their migrant status, and this is supposed to be the basis for all the laws. This should be the same within data and data on development of child migration and protection policies. But at the same time, we know from the Fatal Journeys report that Bridget mentioned that between 2014 and 2018, more than 1,825 children were reported dead or missing during migration journeys. And this is only one small part of the picture, and many more incidents go unrecorded. And children are among the most vulnerable of the groups of migrants. The evidence for those statements can be found in Fatal Journeys Volume 4, but also in the Missing Migrants database of the IOM's Global Migration Data Analysis Centre in Berlin. UNICEF also published a hard-hitting report in 2016 which looked at, entitled Uprooted, the Growing Crisis for Refugee and Migrant Children, which highlighted the need for timely and reliable data so that states can more effectively meet their protection obligations. In fact, we know in the area of missing children and deaths of children that states are actively not meeting their protection obligations, and in fact actively in many cases attempting to avoid meeting those obligations. So the International Data Alliance on Children on the Move is an attempt at a global level to address with 30 government agencies, NGOs, civil society, to address this need for better evidence base. And across all countries, there's a growing awareness that not enough is known about the increasing numbers of children on the move who have protection needs and need protection from violence and abuse. And little enough is known about what is happening with unaccompanied asylum-seeking children, refugee children, and those displaced within national borders, as well as trafficked children. And the problem, the data problem, is one of really of lack of sources and of timely data. And there's also an issue around, for example, disability. The global evidence base on child migrants and refugees is incomplete, and there's too little understanding about what is happening with disability, the causes of what happens to children during journeys, and what happens to children with disabilities before they start their journeys. So I won't go into all the detail of the data problems. I can provide the detailed slides that I'm reading from here. But I think there are examples of good practice as well, where it's not all a very bad message about the data. In ECOWAS in West Africa, there have been significant efforts to improve the collection of data on children, to monitor the observance of requirements under the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. And I'm aware that many of these efforts on paper look very good, but in reality perhaps are not actually as effective as we might wish them to be. But in regional collaboration, some efforts being made around the registration of children in schools, disaggregating data by education and migratory status, and use of school registers as one initiative. Always the problem will be with resources, with understanding undocumented child labour, trafficking. The framing of all these issues comes from the European Union, the Eurocentric gaze, and it's important to disentangle at national and local and regional level what the actual issues are. So I think ECOWAS, which perhaps Sam's going to say something about what's happening with the families and the realities, the human realities, perhaps could be an area in which there is some potential for developing better practice, and that the European Union could perhaps learn, if it wanted to, could learn from better practice in Africa. So I talked a bit there about the data efforts. I think they should only ever be seen as one small part of the picture, and that the horrific figures that we have, that we know how many children die during journeys, it is only known how many that evidence has been found by the officials and the reporting bodies in the European Union and across the UN. So there is a lot of work to be done, and I think the only way to understand better what policy needs are and how policy should be improved has to be led by listening to families and people, those left behind, people who have lost children, if we're talking about fatalities, but also to learn from what the priorities should be in policy, to learn that it's time that the European Union and the member states of the European Union, as well as the UK, actually stopped informing the rest of the world what to do, but started to listen about what the human priorities and needs are, other than including but other than data. So I hope that's something of a useful introduction to how much is known and how little is known by officials, and my plea for everyone to listen rather than to be preaching from Europe. And so I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Anne. And I think that's a good time to pass over to Sam, who's going to talk to us about the work that he has been doing also with families of people who have been left behind. Sam.
Thank you very much, Bridget. Is my video on? No, it's not. Okay, hi. So hi everybody. Thanks very much for coming and to MMB for organizing this event. I think Bridget gave us a very good overview of the challenge as it stands at the moment. And over the past decades, we've all seen the tragic cases of migrants who lose their lives in the course of their journeys, mainly as a result of being forced to use precarious, hazardous immigration routes as a result of inhumane immigration policies and other constraints. Many of us have seen the images and videos, or perhaps even directly witnessed some of these incidents, including, the more recent ones ongoing in the English Channel and elsewhere. Certainly the cases of the 39 Vietnamese who were asphyxiated in the back of the lorry. I'm sure we all heard these stories. And data from the IOM, the Missing Migrants project, to which Anne referred earlier, shows that at least 46,000 people have perished under such circumstances, 915 this year so far. This is just the tip of the iceberg, because again, I think Bridget made this point that there are many more whose deaths are unrecorded, or whose bodies are not found, or indeed others who simply go missing or lost, or whose relatives and loved ones lose contact with them. And so there are many people who are left living in agony, seriously traumatized as a result of not knowing about the whereabouts of their relatives or loved ones who have gone missing in the course of migration. And even where the deaths or whereabouts of people are covered by the media, the impacts of these tragedies on those who are left behind, the families and loved ones who are left behind, tends to be peripheral to the discussions. And so the IOM commissioned a study, which I carried out here in the UK, to explore the impacts of these deaths on those who have been left behind, i.e. families and relatives and loved ones who are either trying to find their lost or missing loved ones, or who are mourning the loss of migrants or relatives who have gone, who've lost their lives in the course of migration. 4 key findings were made by this study. Interviews were carried out with people from 7 different nationalities. The report for this project is coincidentally being published tomorrow. And 4 key findings have been made, which I will just run over quickly before focusing more specifically on the experiences of some individuals and children in particular who are affected by this issue. So what we found from this research is that families who are left behind, relatives who are dealing with the loss and trauma associated with this issue urgently need answers, because we found that the passage of time deepens rather than heals the diverse emotional, psychological and other adverse impacts associated with the loss. Furthermore, missing migrants' families themselves are often migrants, some of whom we found may have experienced precarious migration routes or hazardous journeys and have faced, similar risks of getting lost or going missing. And this trauma associated with the loss of their relatives is therefore exacerbated because of their own circumstances, as of having experienced similar events themselves. And again, we found in the study that the search for missing or lost migrant relatives is compounded by multifaceted obstacles such as precarious socioeconomic circumstances and insecure immigration status as well. So, lack of information of where to search, gender discrimination, and a host of other issues. And all of these, the intersection of all of these means that a lot of families, relatives who are left behind face immense mental health problems. It produces acute desperation that also leaves some open to exploitation, fraud, and criminality. I'll just share my screen very quickly just to highlight some of the accounts or narratives which were shared with us in this research. So for a lot of families, as they told us, the problem is not just, the fact that they are missing relatives, that is the consequences on them, as I was trying to explain earlier. They told us that you keep experiencing the problem, as Ali, a Sudanese man, said. The sense of loss never leaves you. So even after the media coverage and everything else, you are left still dealing with the trauma of it. And, hearing about people who are making the crossing in the Mediterranean and elsewhere brings all of the trauma back again. Similarly, James, a Nigerian man who was searching for his son, told us about how, the loss and the circumstance under which it happened, because he lost contact with him when they were making the Mediterranean crossing, has led him to alcoholism and, the use of drugs and others. Again, thinking of the immigration system and how it continues to impact adversely on the lives of those who are left behind. These quotations, for instance, bring those to bear, how people are unable to search properly or even deal with the loss while they are themselves trying to secure or obtain a more secure immigration status, and how immigration status really makes it impossible to deal adequately or appropriately with the challenges confronting them. Likewise, for children in particular, we found that some children really, and I've said this elsewhere, there's a real paradox in a lot of these conversations. Bridget rightly pointed out the fact that typically children are seen in a more sort of romantic light, and there is sometimes a greater tendency to be more sympathetic to children in immigration considerations. The paradox, however, is that once the person reaches 18, this seems to shift entirely. So in the UK, upon reaching the age of 18, a more antagonistic relationship emerges in immigration rhetoric, where young people are forced to try to avoid detection as a result, out of fear of being deported because they are now seen as adults. So in this case, Shehu, a Nigerian man who lost contact with his son because his son was afraid of being basically afraid that once he reaches the age of 18, he will be deported either in the UK or in France, and therefore try to avoid detection by leaving his parents. I'm going to stop here, and hopefully we will get more time to discuss some of these issues. But just to say broadly, the issue of those who are left behind is underexplored, and many families are left dealing with the trauma of not knowing about the whereabouts of their loved ones, or not being able to properly grieve for those who have lost their lives in the course of migration. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sam. And whatever his age, 18, 19, he's always Shehu's child. Just doesn't stop being Shehu's child just because he hits 18.
Indeed, yeah.
So now I'd like to invite Nadine to tell us more about the situation in the UK and the Channel. Thank you, Nadine.
Thank you, Bridget. My presentation is slightly different in that I'm talking about unaccompanied children who've actually arrived in the UK. But I would pick up on something that Sam just said. In fact, my experience and my research has shown that actually children are not treated that much better than adults. In fact, children are quite often seen to be people who are coming here just to get jobs or education, and quite often maybe even treated worse. What I've decided to do is, in the brief time I've got, is to actually concentrate on a few of the experiences of children who do arrive in this country. Now, one will have heard a lot about the small boats arriving in Dover, but in fact, small boats are arriving all along the south coast, from Kent across to Hampshire and Dorset, and up the eastern seaboard between Essex and Lincolnshire. And many of those children, and there are quite a lot of unaccompanied children in those arrivals, are arriving in containers. So they're quite often arriving at quite obscure ports you may not even have heard about up the coast. Now, the Home Office itself doesn't really publish much at all about these children who arrive and the conditions they face. But HM Inspector of Prisons is responsible for all detention, and it's responsible when Border Force is detaining people. And Border Force does have small detention facilities at many airports and seaports. And so the inspector looked at a number of these locations about a year ago. One of the places in this list was actually Bristol Airport, which may be of interest to some people. He looked particularly at seaports, Felixstowe, Killingham, and Purfleet, Tilbury, and found that the conditions were very poor, but in particular for children, there seemed to be no centralised records of how long they were held. In fact, he wasn't even sure that Border Force knew how many children they'd held, because at the beginning of the inspection, Border Force were not even able to tell them how many holding facilities they had at seaports and airports. But he concluded that quite a lot of children were being held up to 14 hours. Now, they're not being held in any kind of facility, they're being held either in a container or still in the ship they came in. They aren't given any access to the outside world in terms of telephones, legal representatives, responsible adults, all the things that one would expect if they were held for a criminal offence in a police station. And of course, they haven't committed any criminal offence apart from entering the country. There were no on-site medical facilities. At most, some of the Border Force officials had some first aid training. Most shockingly, he discovered that some of the children held in Portsmouth and Poole had been handcuffed as a regular occurrence, and also placed in cellular vans when they moved to other facilities. And at Tilbury, it was clear that some children were being not allowed to disembark from vessels or containers and were summarily returned to France. So therefore, the actual situation at the moment, if children do make it over the Channel, is very poor. Now, of course, the inspection was only a snapshot. It was only what children were found at on those particular dates. But the suggestion is that actually, when you roll out the findings, many, many more children would have been affected. The inspector then moved on to look in particular at people arriving in Kent, and he found that at Tughaven, a sort of facility for arrivals, when a person, either an adult or a child, is picked up from a boat or a container, they're taken to a place. Now, in fact, they're taken to a place and mostly they will be soaking wet, have not had any food recently, and be quite traumatized. The description given in that place was that it was unfit for its purpose. It was a building site and there were basically no facilities there. Now, some of the children, we then moved on to Kent Intake Unit, which is an improvement in Tughaven, but not much of an improvement. Now, the thing is that under the ECHR, there is some ability to detain people for immigration purposes. But in the UK, under Section 5 of the Immigration Act, it's been decided that children can't be detained for more than 24 hours. Now, the Children's Commissioner, another regulatory body, then stepped in and did her own inspection of the Kent Intake Unit. And she was shocked to find how many children had been detained for over 24 hours in this unit. Now, the legal position is that as soon as a child is recognised to have arrived, Border Force should contact social services, you should come and pick up the children. This whole process seems to have fallen down, particularly last year when Kent was overwhelmed by the number of unaccompanied children arriving. And so these children were remaining in the Kent Intake Unit. And it's important to say that the intake doesn't have any beds. The kids don't get out into the fresh air. There's been a procedure which releases them from statutory detention into what's called the atrium. But the atrium also has no beds and no access to fresh air. It does have access to a little more entertainment and better food. But what she found was that children being detained in the atrium for up to 4 days before it could be resolved, and some social services came to collect them. It also appeared that the data about hours kept was skewed by the fact that Border Force wasn't counting interview time into detention time. So if a child was interviewed, they stopped the clock and the child be interviewed for maybe 3 or 4 hours. Then they start the clock again and would say the child being detained. It also was apparent from the records that the Children's Commission was able to access that these interviews often took place in the middle of the night. Therefore, these children are both being detained and treated very poorly at the time they are in the Kent Intake Unit. One other glaring difficulty for these children is that they often have their ages disputed. Now, I put this data up, not that data is always accurate, because of course all kinds of things play into it. In fact, you'll notice if you can add up that the year ending December 2020 doesn't seem to add up, and that's because there'll be many age disputes which are unresolved at the end of the year because a child's gone missing or there's been some double counting. But the interesting thing is that it's clear in the 2020 that many more children being age disputed. Now, it's difficult to make conclusive findings, but the methodology that is supposed to be applied is quite clear. But because of many cases that went through about age disputes, local authorities have to conduct an age assessment, and they have to do it in what's called a Merton compliance method, looking at all the different evidence about a child's age. And the case I've mentioned, RIE, was a conclusion by the Supreme Court that it was for the court, for the tribunal to decide on the legal age of the child, and then it was for the local authority to decide what provision they should make for that child. In 2015, there was also very good guidance published, which was the result of multidisciplinary work, lawyers, medical experts, social workers and others, who tried to provide guidance in what's a very difficult area, because of course you can only really assess how mature a child is. Assessing their precise chronological ages is practically impossible. But it appears that in 2018, 2019, when contract social workers were employed by the Home Office and put in the Kent intake unit, that things began to go wrong and that many more children were age assessed as being adults. This appears to be because a short form age assessment was being used, which was really an assessment of appearance and the child's attitude. Now, this has been challenged in the case I put here called AB, but the court decided that short form age assessments weren't necessarily completely wrong, but if they took place, there should be a real understanding of the variety of indicators of age, and therefore the benefit of the doubt should be given to those children. And there should be acknowledgement of a margin of error, which there hadn't been in AB. But the problem is that there are many more short form age assessments which are still standing and still being challenged in the courts. Now, the present conditions at the border are likely to get much more difficult for these children if the new plan for immigration is rolled out. Some of you may have read about it or read it itself recently, and it's a plan for immigration which will become a bill fairly shortly. It views migrants in a very negative light, and it will have a serious impact on many children arriving. I will just go through some of the worst parts about the arrival elements of it. It's likely detention and reception centres will be reintroduced. Some years ago at Oakington and elsewhere, as a matter of course, migrants arriving would be placed in a reception centre to be processed, and children were in those centres. After many battles, it was found to be illegal to detain a child, even with their parents, and therefore those centres closed. But it looks like the government intends to reopen such centres. They are likely to also be home to some unaccompanied children who are age disputed. There are many concerns about children who've been trafficked within the migration flow, because the government is proposing to raise the standard of proof. But at the moment, it's a reasonable chance of trafficking, but they're not content with that. They want to raise it to a balance of probabilities, which would be very difficult, as it is so difficult to identify children who've been trafficked, and they themselves rarely have any evidence to support their case. In terms of age assessments, the government's suggesting there's up-to-date scientific technology which could actually accurately assess a child's age, such as x-rays of clavicles, x-rays of hands, or other dental x-rays. All of this technology has been comprehensively disputed by the Royal Colleges and also by individual doctors and experts. And the sector had thought that this battle had been won, but it seems to be coming back again. They're also proposing a national age assessment board, which appears to be staffed by contracted social workers who presumably would be employed by the Home Office. This would cause real difficulties for local authorities who may come to their own assessment of a child's age to have it overturned by a National Age Assessment Board staffed by the Home Office. There's also a wish to talk about children being significantly over 18, not 25, which is a test for immigration and border officials. And of course, as the ability to accurately pin down chronological age is so difficult, having an 18 benchmark is bound to be even more inaccurate and give no balance of probabilities, sorry, no margin of error. They also wish to replace judicial review with a statutory appeal, but they haven't actually identified any court or tribunal which would be able to take that appeal unless a decision was made by the Home Office, because at the moment the immigration tribunals only have jurisdiction to look at decisions by the Home Office. That's just a very quick run through those. I'm quite happy to take further questions.
Great, thanks very much, Nadine. And could I ask Sam and Anne to put their cameras on?
The host has stopped us.
Oh, let me see. Hi there.
Hi.
So yeah, so thanks for that really interesting presentations, and actually all going well, really well together. And I suppose I've got a kind of overarching question, which sort of really takes off from what you were talking about, Anne, when you were talking about kind of the importance of practice and data and practice. And so I suppose the question is how to move from paper to practice. And that's a question for all of you. So, and maybe, you know, what are the next steps? It's very, we can all see what the problems are. So how can we start, you know, what's the next steps in practice? And what are the, you know, and what's the role for research in those next steps? So that's really a question for all of you, but I wonder if I could start with Anne and then go to Sam and then Nadine.
Yeah, I think in some ways it's possible to fall into the trap of just rehearsing again and again all the problems, what the horrific situation is. And in a way, it's important to keep reminding the policy audiences and the public in the European countries what's happening, but also I think that enough research has been done already. It's not necessary to keep continually going over the ground, which in the Mediterranean Missing Project, we looked at the work of people who'd worked on ambiguous lots in previous research studies, and then it was used to apply to what was happening in the Mediterranean. And researchers themselves, I myself have suffered from doing this work. It's a traumatogenic area to work in. It's not good for the researchers as well to be doing this, as well as the people who we're talking about. So I think that the next step is to stop migration researchers stop calling for more resources to improve data and all the work that I've been doing, but for that exercise to be carried out by officials and NGOs and families, saying what is really needed in this area, what do we need to know about what's happened to our family members, how we working with, from my point of view, working with civil society in Italy, for example, to help support survivors who've arrived in Italy and who are trying to trace other survivors or trying to trace back to their families, and providing that kind of practical emotional support is important. And just to keep on, those who have the energy to keep on trying to persuade the public to really adopt a different narrative about what is happening, to look at this as a human issue rather than an issue of border controls. And I think the work that Sam is doing and that Nadine has spoken about, actually it highlights this fact that it's a very human issue, and if we get it right for children, then it's going to be right for adults. But it's not enough to even just get it right for adults, it has to be right for everyone. So I don't have the answer, but I know that we haven't found a solution yet, and acknowledging the real human cost of this is probably what has to be the starting point.
Thanks, Anne. Sam?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. So I suppose I will respond by highlighting some of the recommendations we make in this research. So first of all, the need for greater awareness raising of these issues is really so important, particularly because, as I indicated in my introduction to the conversation, there is, while the media covers the boat disasters and the issues ongoing in the English Channel and elsewhere, there is relatively limited awareness of the impact these issues have, these losses and tragedies have on families or those who are left behind. Indeed, I think it was quite striking that in the case of the SX-39, there were efforts by some media organizations to go to Vietnam to speak with families, but all of that has since petered out. There isn't much work now about how these families are coping. And so information and awareness raising is so very important in terms of a more practical or next step requirements. But added to that, there's also the issue of more support with the search itself. So for those who are dealing with the subject of ambiguous laws, as Anne pointed out, or those who simply don't know where their loved ones are, I think one of the issues our participants consistently raised was the fact that in the UK, there is no support at all if you are looking for a missing migrant relative, particularly if the person did not go missing here in the UK. So if, say, you've lost contact with them while you're trying to get to the UK or while they were trying to get to the UK, reporting to the UK police makes no difference, and even mentioning it, as some would have expected, mentioning it in the course of their Home Office interviews, they thought was going to lead to some sort of, trigger some kind of support or assistance, but none of that was forthcoming. The only organization which seems to be doing work in this area is the Red Cross, but again, there is only so much they can do given the scale of the problem. So more support with the search, and this includes psychological, psychosocial counseling, socioeconomic support, because for many people in this position, socioeconomic constraints and also issues to do with immigration and so on mean that there is not enough resource, financial or material, to actually do the work required. So I would say these four key things are what are needed.
Thanks, Sam. Nadine?
Yeah, it's my view that a lot more research is needed, and particularly this juncture, because as I said, we appear to be going backwards, going over old ground. Just quickly, as an aside to Sam, there was an organisation that did successfully trace disappeared children coming from France, which was CTAC, which was part of NSPCC, but unfortunately NSPCC decided to close that particular unit down, but they successfully found a number of children. One of the problems about research is that to actually discover what unaccompanied children need and what their situation is, it's often the lawyers or the NGO advocates that are the ones who are in touch with them. And there have been a number of research projects which have come out of lawyers and NGOs concerned, but they've tended to be funded by the EU Commission, which of course is not really a viable option anymore. Sometimes it's been funded by UNICEF and UNHCR, but there could well be more collaboration with universities. And the only university to date who's done a significant amount of work in the University of Bedfordshire, which has got together with experts, non-academic experts, to do some quite interesting projects. But I do think that introduction of policy experts in this particular unit is very interesting, because of course it does bring a different dimension to the work. Because I've done a lot of research, but I have no PhD. I just have a different action research approach to it, and also assisted by being a lawyer. But I think there is a good theme of collaboration that can be built up between academics and people on the ground, particularly NGOs and lawyers.
Anne?
Yeah, sorry, I should have been slightly less negative about research, because I think it is, I agree with Nadine, it is important. And one thing that worries me, and I would love to be able to walk away from the work on data, but I don't think I'll be allowed to. The work on data means that we have to have a credible evidence base, which is more than the kind of figures that are thrown around that we saw in 2016 when Europol came up with a figure of 10,000 missing children in Europe. And that was linked to a call for resources and for funding. There was no credible base for that figure. It was a broad-based estimate. And then recently, in the last few days, last week, some journalists have come up together with a blog talking about thousands of other children missing across Europe. But when you look at where they actually found their information and data from, then nearly every single country that they list is problematic regarding the data. It's really a concocted figure. So I think the issues are important, and perhaps the issues and the experiences of children, it's more important to log and note that, as Sam was talking, rather than to try and come up with sensational figures of how many children are missing. Because very often children might be missing for very good reasons from the radar of the authorities, but then they still have protection needs, or they still need to have issues addressed, which Nadine's talking about, that we need those numbers. So I suppose we need two different types of research. We need the qualitative and the quantitative research. And the qualitative research around values and normative type of approach to what is actually needed to generate knowledge that will inform better practice is perhaps important. At the same time, I can understand the legal need for, and the approach that you need vigorous numbers and the legal debates. So I'm quite conflicted about this, but I think that data are important. It's just important to know what the data mean and how to interpret them.
Thanks, Anne. And I don't know, when you were talking, and particularly when Sam was talking, I was remembering a situation where I was working with a woman who'd been in the asylum system for the best part of 10 years, who was recognised as a refugee and was desperately trying to find her young children, whom she'd had to leave in her country of origin, in order to be able for them to join her before they hit 18. The way in which I think children can be missing, because they were actually, in fact, she ended up doing a radio campaign because her children were on the street, and that seemed to be the best way of trying to get hold of them. So children can go missing in so many different ways, and when they come into view as missing, and when it's just unimportant that they're missing from a kind of European perspective, I think is also worth us kind of contemplating. Certainly it seems like, you know, a lot of money and resources can go into funding age assessments. How about money and resources going into supporting the kind of psychological, you know, needs of people who have been traumatized by these sorts of controls? Anyway, we've unfortunately, even though we're only just got started, we're now come to the end of our hour, but I'd like to request that people stay for a minute. We switch our cameras off, people stay for a minute and observe in cyberspace a minute's silence to remember the children and young people and others who've died in their efforts to move, and think about what we can do to support them and their loved ones. So but before you go, just to draw your attention to the event that Anne put in the chat that's happening tomorrow. Is that right, Anne?
Yes, it's that's put the link there for, so you need to register. It's a session on the protection of migrant children in the African context, and it's being led by the African Union and IOM. So it should be interesting from a different perspective, I think, the discussions around data, but not from a European-based perspective.
Okay, thanks. Thank you, and thank you everybody for coming.